Okay, so what is environmental sustainability? One of the things that we always mull over is what is the definition of sustainability? Is there a set definition? And a lot of times there really is not. So what the Environmental Committee has gone through is said, okay, this is our working definition of sustainability. Essentially, they said it's strategies, programs, and practices for using resources to meet society's present needs. That way, the resources are not depleted and not damaged, and that way we preserve them for future use. So they're trying to formulate their plans and activities according to this definition of sustainability. So what is our efforts? It's a multifaceted effort, and at the core of it really is looking at carbon footprint. We have outlined by the various years some of the different activities that are currently going on and then planned to be going on. The one that I'll be discussing today is the carbon footprint for 2011. But also, just so you know, there is a water footprint study looking at available usage of water and how water use is going. That'll be next year. In 2013 will be air emissions. That may also utilize some of the recent NAMES data, the air emissions study. And then lastly, the land use or the land footprint in 2014. So those are some of the activities that are currently ongoing. So why do we even bother with sustainability? A lot of people kick that language around. Well, it fits in very well with our We Care, the 6 points that we have for our We Care programs. And really it's wanting to do what's right for the industry. So you can see the 6 individual points that we have listed. And where this fits under really is to safeguard natural resources. But also, if you look at use and sustainability of the industry as a whole, really they can fit under all of these different individual points. Producing safe food, protect animal and promote animal well-being, protect and ensure public health practices, provide a safe work environment, and then contribute to a better quality of life in communities. By doing sustainability, really we do fulfill all 6 of those points. Obviously, as we discussed this morning, there are some changes going on in the marketplace. Consumers and customers do want to know more about what are each of these individual farms doing to support the environment, to support the farming practices that they use. They want to know, how is their food quality impacted, how is their environmental quality impacted, and if I buy this piece of pork, am I damaging the environment or not? Am I being sustainable as well? Obviously, we know there's a lot of increasing pressure from outside groups that aren't necessarily favorable to the pork industry, so that's also why we want to have some information available to be able to combat those messages and say, we do have scientific and factual information that shows that pork production is environmentally friendly. And then lastly, we do need to build and maintain trust, not only with the people within the industry, but a lot of our allied industries, partners, and other associations that we do what we say what we mean, and these are the things that we're doing, and we stand behind it. It does benefit producers. Again, it can help improve management efficiency of their outputs and inputs. There can be some reduced cost potentials, and we'll get into that a little bit later. And then also potential revenue sources from some of the manure products that are created from hog production, and that may or may not be tapped into right now. So some of the expected outcomes for the carbon footprint, really the main one is to have an analytical tool that producers can use. And really this will help benchmark their production and say, okay, here's what we're currently doing today. What is our footprint? How is that impacted? And then they can go and say, is there areas that we can improve upon, and what are our options for doing that? We also want to be able to take credit and show what the industry is doing to improve their practices, and then identify what are other areas that need to be worked on that are a potential problem. And again, all of this will be able to provide data to help defend our industry and also to support dialogue as far as scientific research needs in the future. So how is this carbon footprint analysis done? Well, there's a couple different approaches. First off is a literature review, essentially looking at what available information is out there currently. The second one is what they call a scan lifecycle assessment for the pork chain, and there's a couple different things going on here. But what they wanted to do is look across the entire pork chain, essentially from the field to the fork, and say what is going on, what are the inputs, what are the outputs, what are the environmental issues that are going on within that continuum. And then also understand what roles live swine does play within that. The second is more of a detailed life cycle assessment. That is looking at basically the field to the gate, basically to the point where animals would be shipped off to slaughter. And then again, understanding what are the roles within that production continuum of the inputs, the outputs that affect environment. This is a pretty busy slide, and I'll help as much as I can. Essentially, if you look really to this far right little diagram, it shows on this life cycle assessment, they were looking at all the inputs on a movement. So for example, if you're raising feeder pigs with your feed inputs, it would look at what are the inputs, what is extracted from the environment, what is released to the environment, and what are the outputs. So for each individual phases of production, whether it's farrowing, processing, feeding, manure management, they would look at this whole systematic way of approaching inputs, outputs, and things like that. Along with this life cycle assessment is really looking at 4 different phases. Obviously, you've got to start with a goal and a scope. What's your goal? What do you want to look at? What is the end outcome? And then how do you go about measuring that scope? And then they'll look at impact, the inventory of issues surrounding that, and then obviously all put that into interpretation of results. For this goal and the scope, again, it's divided into a couple different things. The goal for the pork supply chain level was basically assuming to have a 1 4-ounce serving of boneless pork to the consumer. That would constitute the field to the fork continuum of the life cycle assessment. The detailed would basically say we have 1 pound live weight sent to harvest. So essentially that one's trying to evaluate what are the inputs from field to the gate, or basically to the truck before that animal is sent to slaughter. The scope would include the fuels that are needed for movement, transport, shipment, but it excludes infrastructure, some of the buildings and the equipment and all that, because that would be taken into account in other areas, looking at some of the fixed energy costs and input for that. If you need a further, more detailed explanation, Alan could probably give that to you better than I can, but that is to the best of my knowledge. So we started basically for 2011 looking at the carbon footprint, really the 3 greenhouse gases, methane, nitrous oxide, and carbon dioxide. Obviously there may be other ones, but these were the big 3 that it was most information is available, and also the ones relevant to the industry. So through the literature review, a lot of the information right now is done in Europe and Denmark. So there is some different approaches and different metrics of measurement. There's a good significance in production differences and how they look at the systems, how the systems are set up compared to the U.S. pork. So a lot of times this particular segment was not necessarily comparable or generalizable to the United States. What he also did find through the literature review, there is no systemic analysis of pork chain emissions. So really what they did is go back and look at focus on initial odor and dust and greenhouse gas emission studies that were available. Obviously, we talked about research needs. This is one where additional information is needed, and that would give us most accurate assessments. But there is a gap in that information, and more work needs to be done. So from the scan level, this is a conceptual model of at least how they were trying to evaluate inputs and outputs regardless of where the animals were located. That's why they excluded buildings and barns. But essentially, to create a slaughter pig, you still need to have gilts coming in with your energy and feed. They go to a sow barn, they're bred. Obviously, pigs go out as weaners, and then they eventually go to the grow site and then go on to slaughter. So this is the conceptual area that they were looking at for this life cycle assessment, basically from birth to slaughter. And that way they could see what was going on over the lifetime of that sow as she produces her pigs. So some of these next couple ones are going to be pretty busy, but they're the assumption pages of what they were looking at for their conceptual model. So you can see they're looking at 9.5 pigs per litter and 3.5 litters per sow over her lifetime productivity. They're estimating a finished weight of 268 pounds. That may fluctuate, but that was the base model. And then you can see the carcass division, it's 75% of live weight, and then boneless cutout would be 65% of carcass. Diet's very similar to what we're using. The manure characteristics are according to the American Society of Agricultural Engineers. And then there's several other things. The climate change tier 2 emissions factor for manure systems was taken into account. Purdue Handbook for Ventilation, biogenic carbon not included. Okay, we'll just go over that one. I'll answer that later if you have questions on that. So some of the preliminary results that we have, the left side basically shows the life cycle total. The right side shows the farm to the gate total. So if you basically just look at the live animal production. Interestingly enough, though, between the consumption and retail and even processing and packaging is a small percentage, but on the consumption side and retail and processing, there is a fair amount of carbon output. Granted, not as high as the live animal side, but there's still a fair amount that goes on as far as carbon emissions and footprint for that particular sector of our industry. Within live animal production, obviously you can see the two biggies are feed and manure. And I'll show another slide on manure. But that's really where some of the initial assessment, where a lot of the footprint values lie. So for example, on manure, one of the findings that they did see are some of the differences in the manure management systems. And even though there are some differences, the main point here is even though there's differences, they weren't statistically significant. And really what this slide is saying is that there are differences in handling manure. They are different, but that's about it. Because sometimes people will see the anaerobic lagoon has a higher bar level or amount of impact from greenhouse gas emissions compared to pasture, deep pit slurry, or solid store. However, the comments that were relayed is basically that they are different systems, they're just different. That's about all you can read into this data at this point in time. And it's not saying one is better or not than the other. So again, this is another slide that I'll relay to you, and we'll go from there. But some of the weighted footprint average, so for example, if you look at the live weight impact, is about 2.87 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalents per kilogram of animal. And that ranges from 2.32 to 3.85, and that is comparison at the farm gate, so prior to slaughter. Same thing, now dress carcass weight is 3.83 kilograms with a range of 3.1 to 5.1. These we're all looking at, again, just from field to a gate before they get sent to slaughter, and then you can see the boneless meat. Or another way to look at it through the life cycle assessment of field to fork is basically 1.5 pounds of carbon dioxide equivalents per 4 ounces cooked serving by U.S. consumer. That's what that carbon footprint would be. Now, okay, this information's nice, but how does this compare to other ones? And we will say a lot of this data is data that was available. It's not always been validated other than the U.S. side. So this is how some of our values correlate. And this is on the carcass weight. So you can see U.S. pork is at 3.8, France is at 3.0. Again, some of these are validated, some are not. So why the significant difference for, say, in Sweden versus the U.S.? There are obviously things that we've mentioned before, difference in production system, difference in feedstuffs and other things utilized. But again, we can't always say that all of these methods of comparison were equal across all areas. For other comparison to other proteins, Alan had utilized a lot of information that was already in existence. Again, this is from literature review. So again, it may not be comparing apples to apples or oranges to oranges. It may be comparing bananas to grapes. But at any rate, this is something at least that you can utilize for a comparison of what other species groups are looking at. So if you keep in mind that swine was, 3.1 to 5.1, a lot of the other species groups are kind of all over the board. So what's next? A lot of this information is still in its infancy and being gathered, but one of the things that they are really working on hard is, like we said, is to have a calculator or an actuator that producers can use to start to create a baseline for their own operations. So that is currently testing in progress. And testing is in earnest. The hope is to have that launched basically at Expo this year. They're trying to refine the pages, go through all the different evaluations and beta testing, but that will be available by Expo. And then obviously along with that, there will be other materials and information that we will have. The intent is basically to hand out a CD of the program that producers can take, put into their own computers and type in onto their own information systems. And then obviously if they have questions on input, they can call into Pork Board or other educators to help out on the input side. So we're really excited to have this launched, and if you guys go to Expo this year, you should see that out there at our booth.